So my name is Scott Langston, and I teach in the religion department here at TCU, and I'm also the university's Native American Nations and Communities liaison. And I want to welcome you to what I think is a very important discussion that is important for our campus, but also for our nation. And that is about the legacies concerning American Indian boarding schools and the role that Christianity played in that. We hope tonight to have a frank, open conversation, nothing disrespectful, but one that deals with the realities of the situations. We do ask, though, that as you get involved as the audience, that any remarks that you may make as you come to the mic will always be done out of respect and with sensitivity, because we know in the audience that we have people who are either the survivors of boarding schools or their family members are survivors, and they still experience the pain and trauma that this period of time brought upon them. So please always act respectfully and mindfully of these people. I want to start tonight by reading the university's land acknowledgement, which you can see up above you here. This was recently adopted across the university. It's much more important than just the reading of it. It's a tool to help bring us to reflection. There's not a lot of good just to read it and leave it there, but we want to use it to reflect upon the benefits and the responsibilities and the relationships that we have. So this was developed by the university's Native American Advisory Circle and then approved by the Chancellor's Cabinet. So let me read it to you now. As a university, we acknowledge the many benefits we have of being in this place. It is a space we share with all living beings, human and non-human. It is an ancient space where others have lived before us. The monument created jointly by TCU and the Wichita and affiliated tribes reminds us of our benefits, responsibilities, and relationships. So we pause to reflect on its words. This ancient land for all our relations. We respectfully acknowledge all Native American peoples who have lived on this land since time immemorial. TCU especially acknowledges and pays respect to the Wichita and affiliated tribes upon whose historical homeland our university is located. So before I introduce our panelists, let me share with you some important information. We want you in the audience to be involved in the conversation, either through asking questions or bringing insights that you may have. And so we're going to encourage that. And the way our session will run tonight is we're going to try to address 3 different questions. And after each question, we will then invite you in the audience to come to one of the mics and either make a comment or ask a further question of our panelists. So you'll have 3 opportunities to be involved as we go through the evening. For students, this perhaps may be the most important thing I can say. If you are here and you need to record your presence here by swiping your ID, there are the ID machines, but they will not be turned on until after tonight's session, okay? So remember that. You can't get access to those until it's all said and done there. So please hold on for that. We also recognize that tonight we're going to be discussing issues that may be particularly difficult to process. We urge everyone to take advantage of the many counseling and support resources available at TCU, as well as in your own local communities. And once again, we want to ask everyone to be sensitive to the pain and trauma that tonight's discussion may produce. We also want to thank TCU's Religion Department, as well as the Native and Indigenous Student Association, because they are the sponsors of tonight's sessions. session, and without their help and support, we would not be able to have this. I now would like to introduce our three panelists, and we are greatly honored to have them here. But if you've been around TCU for very long, you know these people because they're constantly here interacting with us. They're kind of like adjunct faculty, part-time employees here, but we're grateful to have them again. So Jody Voice Yellowfish is on the far end down there. She is Muskogee Creek. Yeah. She is Muskogee Creek, Oglala, Lakota, and Cherokee. She was born and raised in Dallas, is a product of the U.S. government's relocation program. She attended Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas, where she received her associate's degree in social work, and she studied for her bachelor's in Indigenous and American Indian Studies. She is also the chairperson for MMIW Texas Rematriate. MMIW stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. She does tremendous work on that terrible issue. She is a board member for Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, and she organizes with Our City, Our Future. She recently became the first Indigenous person to be appointed to Dallas's Arts and Culture Advisory Commission, and she's possibly the first ever to serve on any board or commission in Dallas. Now, if you think about that, that's remarkable. And she is also an adoptive parent to her niece and two nephews. Annette Anderson is here closest to me. She is Chickasaw and Cherokee, a licensed clinical social worker and a member of the Council for the Indigenous Institute of the Americas, which is located in Plano, Texas. She is the founder of the Institute's Seed Protector Education Initiative, which helps youth as well as adults grow through an understanding of the connection between plants and humans to the preservation of native lifeways. And she too is a frequent speaker here at TCU. She is also a member of our university's Native American Advisory Circle. So Annette, welcome here. And then last is Chaban Colonel in the middle here. Chaban is a citizen of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. He is a traditional leader of the Hlubi Ceremonial Grounds, which is the Muskogee Creek grounds. He is the executive director of the Native American Comprehensive Plan for the United Methodist Church. He has been involved since the very beginning of TCU's various Native American initiatives in 2015. And it's fair to say, we would not be here tonight were it not for Chaban Colonel. Truly. And really, the initiatives that have been going on since 2015 started with Chaban. And he has been here with us ever since, guiding us. There was a time when I could say he has spoken every semester on our campus, but then COVID hit and interrupted the streak there. So now we're starting a new one for that. Chaban is also a member of TCU's Native American Advisory Circle, and we're very fortunate to have him with us tonight as well. Okay, so there are the introductions. I want to take 2 or 3 minutes just to set a framework for our discussion tonight. And after I do that, then we'll go to our first of the 3 questions. We'll go through those 3 questions, and then we're going to reserve about the last 5 minutes or so of our time together where Chaban is going to lead us in an honoring of the children who went through these schools and their families. So please, that will be the last thing that we do. So you were given, as you came in, a 1-page handout sheet where we tried to cram as much information as we could on that 1 page, just to give you a basic background for understanding the American Indian boarding school experience. I think it's important to realize that we're talking about a period in time, but really since the very beginning of colonization, going all the way back to Columbus, non-native peoples, Europeans, and later Americans have been attempting to use education to destroy Native American cultures and peoples and societies. The boarding schools that we're going to be talking about today was one manifestation of that effort. They had their day. There's still a few that are around, but the use of education to accomplish the goals of colonization, which would ultimately result in the taking of Native American lands and resources, and then by extension, the extermination and control of Native peoples. This is ongoing today. It is not something that was in the past and is over with. So this is very much a contemporary issue that we are dealing with. Christianity has been at the heart of these efforts. Now, that's a hard thing to say on the campus of Texas Christian University, but this is a reality. Christianity, through its various doctrines and texts and rituals and denominations and other resources that it had, was intent on converting Native American peoples not only to Christianity, but to everything Western, everything European, and everything American. This is oftentimes not talked about as much as it should be, and so that's why we wanted to include it tonight. Now, I'm not going to give you a class session, otherwise we'd be here for a very long time, but I just wanted very quickly to reference some ways that Christianity is involved in this discussion, because oftentimes, especially Christians, are not aware of this. And one of the things that I hear most often from my students is, well, this is a distortion of Christianity. But in reality, it is not. This is what I'm about to show you is not coming from the fringe elements of Christianity. This is mainstream America. This is mainstream Christianity that these attitudes and actions are reflected on. So there are many biblical narratives and biblical passages that are used in this effort to take Native American lands and to create a genocide. One of the favorites, though, has been the biblical story of the Exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, where they gained their freedom, and then they went into what was called the Promised Land, Canaan. Today we call it Israel and Palestine, and then they took that land. A very important and influential biblical passage that the United States has used, and there are Europeans before that, but this notion of chosenness, that Christians and the United States are somehow chosen by God to be here in this place, and it is their right to be here, is pulled directly out of the Bible in these biblical passages. And I show you this one passage here because it is particularly prominent over the centuries. But this is the passage where the Israelites were commanded that when they go into the Promised Land, they are to kill the Canaanites who live there. Wipe them all out. Kill them all. And in American history, Native peoples have from time to time been referred to as red Canaanites. And the message is clear if you know the Bible, how you are to treat Canaanites. Along with that, in this passage, it's pointed out that the reason for the killing is because the Canaanites will cause you to be unfaithful to God. And later on, we'll see they're called idolaters. And therefore, as idolaters, they cannot be tolerated. I'm not going to read this quote to you, but I just put it up there just to show that I'm not making this up. This comes from an early Spanish official who, in making his argument as to why the Spanish could wage war against Native peoples, he pulled directly on the passage that we were just looking at. And in there, you'll notice he uses the term idolatrous Indians. That is a very lethal term in Christian history. To label somebody as an idolater, a non-Christian, carries with it these kinds of actions. To be fair, there were Christians within the Spanish Empire who contested the mistreatment of native peoples. Probably the most famous is Bartolomé de las Casas, who I've given you this quote from here. But what I want to point out about this is even Las Casas, who did so much to resist what the Spanish were doing to native peoples, even Las Casas believed that God had given the Spanish Christian, the Roman Catholic Church, this land, and that they were here to convert native peoples. So really, these two individuals are working for the same outcome. They're just taking different routes to get there. In the United States history, manifest destiny is one of the biggest ways that Christianity has been influential. This idea that God created the United States in order to do something special by bringing out the truth of God, and that God gave the United States this land in order to be his people. This quote, which actually comes from the individual who's credited with having coined the phrase manifest destiny, although he didn't make up the concept, it's been involved since the beginning of the United States. But in this phrase, what I think is interesting is how religious language is just flowing out of his argument that it is the destiny of the United States to live on these lands, and how he talks about America has been chosen. This is the root of American exceptionalism coming straight out of Christianity. Just a couple more things. This quote from the Secretary of the Interior, Henry M. Teller, in 1883, demonstrates how the United States government was in partnership with the various denominations of the Christian church to not only enact the boarding schools, but to fulfill all of these goals of colonization, to take the lands from native peoples and ultimately to create a genocide, either physically or culturally, against them. And you can see here where the Secretary of the Interior acknowledges this. The government furnishes the teachers. The charitable people contribute to the support of the missionaries, and much time, labor, and so on. It was a partnership. And then this quote from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in the same year. What I think is so compelling about this quote is how he just straight up admits that one thing that Christianity brings to this genocide against native peoples is a moral force which the government actions by themselves could never have brought. In other words, Christianity made genocidal actions moral in a perverted sense of the way. And that's part of the partnership between the U.S. government and the Christian peoples. But it's easy to bash the government, and it's easy to bash the church. But we should always remember that the reason why the government and the church were taking these actions is because individuals were pressuring them to do so. Individuals like my ancestors were pressuring the government to do these things. And then just two pictures, very famous pictures from the boarding schools. Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which, by the way, on this day in 1879, Carlisle Indian Industrial School formally opened. It was the first off-reservation boarding school exclusively for Native American children, where this process of removing everything native from the child and replacing it with everything American and Christian took place. And this gives you an example of how Carlisle would boast about what they were doing. This is the before and after of this individual, how it was everything to be transformed, from everything outward to everything inward. And then here is another picture of these children, the before and after of what they were put through. And then just to remind us, these are just pictures of how colonization and what took place in the boarding schools continues today, just in different forms. So this hopefully provides some framework for us to have this conversation tonight And now I want to go to our panelists, and we want to take up the first question. And that first question we want to consider is, what are the legacies of Christianity and the boarding schools? Now, we could talk all night about that, but just from your perspective and your experience, what are the legacies of Christianity and the boarding schools? And I think our panelists have decided that they're going to start with Siobhan. So, Siobhan.
Thank you, Dr. Langston. Once again, it is my privilege to be here on campus to think and to talk a little bit about our Indigenous peoples. And I would be amiss if I did not, with the utmost respect, come up here and speak first. As I was sharing with Jody and Annette, that it's with reverence and that I accept this speaking first, because the male voice in our understanding and our cosmologies of Indigenous peoples, we should not ever speak in front of the Indigenous female, the Indigenous woman, who are the caretakers of this Earth Mother. And we're the ones that have done violence to this earth and to life. And so it's only with their permission that I'll speak first, if that's okay. When we think about the legacy, as Dr. Langston was saying, of this time, is that really today, in this moment, we are still unraveling what that legacy entails. The very reason that we are all here today and tonight is because of what society is calling discoveries of mass graves that were unmarked of children who died while in these re-education centers. If this had not happened over the course of the past year or so, would we be having a panel discussion right now about boarding schools? The frank answer is probably not. Even though those of us that come from Indigenous Native American communities have been saying day after day after day, this is our history. This is what has happened to us. And even we have celebrated the moment because we have survived that history. We are still standing with our languages, our spiritualities, and those things which the Creator has given us, despite being taken from our homes. So when we think about the legacy, I don't even know if I can really do it justice to say, let's start somewhere. But nonetheless, we're going to. So in just a few minutes that I have, for us to know truly how the term is genocidal, but even sadistic this moment in time is, you have to begin to realize where our communities were at this moment. When we think about the establishment of boarding schools, residential schools in our communities, this is around the era of, and we're just going to say mid-19th century, when this policy began to take fruition. So let's just think for a moment, and I say this everywhere I go. Let's for a moment pause and think about the populations of Indigenous peoples here in these territories. 100% of the population was Indigenous. Now, depending on what scholar, which type of rubric they're using, it ranged anywhere on the low end from 10 million persons all the way on the higher end to over 100 million Indigenous persons. Well, I usually take there's some scholarship that has come out of the University of Wisconsin that says around 56 million is the estimated population. I kind of laugh at that scholar because he kind of took a number right in the middle, so to speak. Well, let's just use that number, 56 million. During the time of removal, the establishment of reservations, Trail of Tears stories, these kind of things that took place was also the same parallel moment in history that boarding schools were established. During this moment, it is estimated collectively that Native American Indigenous persons here numbered around 244,000 survivors. That's after displacement, that's after war, that's after being exposed to the elements, and even some of our own ancestors, depending on what part of this continent we came from, were put into slavery as well. 244,000. So let's do the math. 56,244,000 survivors. That means when the boarding school policy was established, 99.996% of the indigenous population had already died. And I stopped there because we aren't taught that in schools. That means every indigenous person that you see here today, my relatives on the panel, relatives over here in their orange shirts, and everyone that has come to hear this speech, means that you are the survivors of a 0.004% of those that were able to overcome this moment in time. That's when the boarding schools were established, when the remnants of our communities were taken as a form of U.S. policy away from their homes and taken to re-education centers in hopes that somehow in their own definitions, somehow some level of humanity could be salvaged from their lives. This is what we are recovering from. Because in this day today, we are still in a denial that this even happened in this moment. We haven't even recognized the egregious nature of the history between indigenous peoples and the establishment of this country. But yet, this is the starting point of recovering so that we can establish a society of wellness for all of our people. So my relative Jody and myself, we come from Muskogee people's heritage. They tell us, our ancestors, they come from the birthplace of our Muskogee people, come from the Okmulgee Mounds, which is in what they are calling Georgia, or the south central part of Georgia, where we have a mound structure that they say is the birthplace of our people. In that one location alone, human inhabitation has been there for 16,000 years, in that one spot alone of our ancestors, the ancient ones. This country, and I just had to do the math on my phone, I'm not a mathematician. This country, 1776 or 74, whatever it is, it's their history, not mine, to now, is only 245 years old. This country is still kind of, the jury is still out on whether it is so-called successful. It's still in its infancy. In fact, my elders would say the United States is still in diapers. It cannot stand up to our cultures because we have withstood the test of time and have endured. This is the history that has been erased. And today, in conversations like this, it's our hope and it's really our demand that we acknowledge that this has happened. We acknowledge that even abroad, there are indigenous communities whose children are being taken right now and forcibly removed to re-education centers in other parts of the world as a part of assimilationist policies and as a part of so-called development and progress. It's still happening. And even we have not even acknowledged the legacy of historical and generational trauma that has been inflicted, because at the end of the day, there's a reason why I'm talking English so fluently to you right at this moment. Today, our hope is that with whatever history has done, that we can now take the steps to recover fully from that. Number one, hoping that we don't harm anybody else. But number two, allowing us the freedom to navigate, to be self-determinant in how we dictate our future as Native peoples. When we think in, and I don't want to take too much time, I don't know, I don't have a clock or anything, forgive me. We think about the legacy that is intrinsically linked between the United States and the Christian faith. That what we propose and the work that I do through my professional job is that they have a dual culpability, is that one hand was helping the other during this moment of time. of helping to rid this country of what they considered us as a problem, and hopefully civilizing us to a point where we would be no more. But the fact of the matter is, these schools had volunteers, they had funding, they had missionaries that came from Christian denominations. And even to this day, we have not even recognized that fully. Because even myself, I have to answer questions. Even though I'm a traditional practitioner and I have our responsibilities that some of you know about to our community, the first question I often get is that, why do you even stay with the church if they have this dual responsibility for our history? And the reason I tell them is because it is they that are the ones that are sick. It is they that are the ones that are lost. It is they that are the ones that are looking to find their way. And at the root of all of our spiritualities, whether it's in North America or even abroad, our traditional practices of indigenous peoples, we always give people the right to be better tomorrow than they were yesterday. And that's very difficult, even today as we suffer. We suffer the realization of how truly deep this trauma is when we don't know when there's going to be another discovery of a cemetery. We don't know when something else is going to happen. But yet, our elders would always say, people don't know what they don't know. But the voices of all of us here are making sure that they know, in hopes that these harms aren't perpetuated another generation from now, in hopes that our grandchildren won't have to have a panel on boarding schools, that they'll say, this is something that was a part of our past, but I'm going to come up here and I'm going to talk to you about language. I'm going to come up here and talk to you about our Earth Mother here. I'm going to come and talk to you about the power of our water and the air. Today, this legacy that they've left, I don't know if we'll ever know the true impact of it. But the reality is, time has gone too far for us to speak the truth. And my hope is that we can continue to build our voices together to share with others who want to join in this conversation.
Yeah, I'm glad that Siobhan ended with that we'll never really know the true legacy. And when we got these questions to prepare, even that word to myself, that's not a word that I'm comfortable with using as legacy. I feel like it's very colonized, and it's not something that I can use myself. Speaking about the future and my family and the work that we do, different things like that. Because when I read these questions and I started to prepare, I was thinking the legacies that come out of that, we'll never know because we're still living through what happened. We're still trying to find the ways to heal from all of that, from everything that started, and doing the MMIW work that our organization does. We see it every day. We hear about how that legacy is still very alive and very real and very pertinent in our everyday lives. Because the first thing I can think of when you think about the legacies of boarding school, you think about government and colonization and how the country was founded and how the land was taken, and everything was forceful. Everything was against the Mother Earth's will. And within a lot of tribes today, every people still say, what happens to the land happens to our women, happens to our people. And, having to have an MMIW organization proves that point. We have a case literally right now, that we're dealing with. And we don't have the resources. And that's exactly what comes out of things like boarding school, trying to kind of mold what community care and mutual care and aid and how to help educate. It was wrapped up in this package with these words that we had no idea what these words meant and what they were. All we knew was that what came with those words, and that was violent, and that was lies, and everything, how those things are upheld with, the legacy of these boarding schools is white supremacy and privilege and institutionalized racism upheld still today in different things that we see all around us. Even within, all the opportunities that I have to speak here on this, this beautiful campus, and I'm always very thankful for, I feel it. I feel out of place when I shouldn't feel out of place in a place of education. But that's the legacy that we're dealing with. That's that violence that our ancestors felt, that I still feel when I walk this campus. I don't feel comfortable, and I don't know if I ever will feel comfortable. And that's a really sad reality. I bring my children to events like this, and they're just like, oh, this is so cool and so neat. And they're just like, I don't know though. And they don't know about the space. And that's that legacy where we know we're not welcomed, in a sense, I guess. And that's all I can think about, is that violence that makes you still feel that generations forward. It's still there. And I just think about, how I mentioned, what happens to the land and happens to our women. And I think about why these boarding schools were placed where they were. And it wasn't by accident. They were very, very strategic in the displacement and the taking of children. And it's just sad. It's just like, it's a very sad situation. And I think about, in my own experience, I think about, this displacement and these boarding schools and mission schools and things like that. They've, to this day, have put, space between myself and my cultures. I have a grandparent that, was born in Pine Ridge and never went back, never wanted his children to go back. He was fearful of the violence, and it was traumatic to even think about and be there. And I grew up not around that. And I still struggle with that. It's a very sad thing. And then I think about some of the great things in my life. Like, one of the experiences that shaped me and made me who I am is attending Haskell Indian Nations University, which was a boarding school. And now I don't know, I can't think of anybody that's non-native that can say they went to a university that used to be a boarding school, used to be a military school, used to be an institution, had a jail, has a cemetery, all of these things. I was studying social work, I was studying Indigenous studies right around the cemetery, and this was our everyday experience. Our everyday experience was knowing that we were fortunate, but that we were surrounded by our ancestors in spirit. And, we knew that things we heard, we had to be kind. These kids never returned home. That's our reality. And I can't tell you a non-native that can say that's their reality. Or their reality is dealing with the violence and not having resources and not having the infrastructure and things like that to not only be safe, but to heal in some kind of way. Those are the legacies that are upheld through boarding schools in the historical sense, I feel like. And there are still boarding schools that are functioning and have really saved people. I know growing up, I wanted to go to boarding schools with my sisters in Oklahoma, and I never got the chance to. So there's a lot to unpack in having this be your history. And I don't know if we'll ever be able to convey that fully to somebody that doesn't feel it deep within their bones and their blood and their memory and feel this the way that we do.
So we want to hear from Annette, but after Annette speaks, we want to give at least a couple people in the audience opportunity to come to one of the mics and either ask a question or make a comment. That'll be after Annette speaks, so you can be formulating in your mind what you might want to do.
All right, thank you very much. Can you all hear me all right? Okay. So I was born and raised in Oklahoma. Siobhan was probably born and raised in Oklahoma. I don't know what parts of it. But I spent my school years in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but I spent all my summers out in the country. And depending on where my grandparents had a ranch, that's where I spent my time. My experience with Christianity is actually very, very limited because of my father and my father's views. My father who was Chickasaw and Cherokee. He had really angry feelings about present day Christianity. He had to live with a white mother who would change churches based on how much they allowed her to have control of the church. You know, she'd give a big offering, and if they didn't do what she wanted to do, then they were going to move to another church and another church and another church. He also had to live with a very racist sheriff stepfather because his father died on the oil rigs in Oklahoma from a heart attack. So I was not raised in any Christian church unless I was forced to go because I was out in the country and that was the only thing you did on a Sunday. If you were at Grandma and Grandpa's, you got dragged to a church. The first church I ever went to that I felt like I might appreciate was a Muskogee Nation Christian church up in the what we'd call mountains of Eufaula. And 99% of the service was singing. It was just singing. The other part was allowing the kids to read their school reports to the community to get some practice talking in front of other people. But there was no preaching from the experience I had in white churches. So this topic is almost, it's got an element of confusion to me because I never studied the Bible. The reason I go to church is because it has the best fry bread in all of Dallas at our Indian church, our Methodist church. But I don't go to services. And I don't go to services for that reason. I didn't sleep at all last night. Kept having my dad in my dreams, kept being haunted by some of our family here in this community and what they've been through, right? And what I want to say is, as a social worker, all of the techniques that were used by the Catholic Church, Presbyterian, the Methodists, the Baptists, whoever was involved with whichever mission or whichever school, were the same types of techniques used today to torture prisoners of war, to get compliance. And when you have hundreds of years of that kind of torture, it causes a molecular level of change in people. We have studied the relatives of Holocaust survivors. They finally are studying the relatives of American Indian families who were in boarding schools, who were on reservations. And we know that the changes on a molecular level, our DNA has changed as a result of the policies of Christianity. It doesn't go away just because you aren't there anymore, and it doesn't go away when the schools have been closed. Even 5 years ago, I had people telling my daughters that they were going to pray for them. They needed to pray for them so that they could find Jesus. And my daughter's response were, "Thank you. You know, we appreciate prayers from anyone." That's what I taught them to do, but I never raised my children in a church either. So I don't know much about, I don't know any of the passages in the Bible that were used, but I do know about the techniques that were used in the boarding schools, residential systems. I was trained in the Indian Child Welfare Act and what the progression of things that the U.S. government and that Christianity did in order to accomplish taking away our culture and trying to force assimilation. So it went from, in Texas anyway, it was from the 1500s when somebody landed on the Gulf Coast. And then from up north, we had the French coming down, right? So there were all kinds of priests and all kinds of missionaries having influence. But I think my point today as a social worker is I see every hour that I'm talking to people, I see the trauma responses, and I hope that we get a chance to talk about that, about how it actually affects the day-to-day lives of the people that were at the boarding schools, their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren in this community. So, that's what I wanted to say for myself right now.
So I want to invite anybody from the audience who would like to ask a question or make a comment, please come to the microphones now. From our three speakers, we can see this is a very complex situation, and there are a lot of avenues that we can pursue. So we'll turn this over to y'all right now. Please tell us who you are and then give us your question or comment.
Hi, my name is Nilofa Bigmarati. I'm Lakota Sioux with the Turtle Clan. I just wanted to give you guys a few statistics on boarding schools. There were about 350 schools across the United States, and the mortality rates at these schools was something like 40%. So if your child was forcibly taken, it was almost half that you wouldn't see them again. I, myself, and my family are running a GoFundMe, and we're about $10,000 away from our goal of purchasing a ground-penetrating radar to use across the United States. So working closely with a company in Canada to achieve that goal. If you're interested, come find one of us in the orange shirts and we can tell you more about it. With the Truth and Reconciliation program that they have in Canada, it was supposed to be an in-depth discovery of what happened at the residential schools. They found that there were about 7,000 children that lost their lives in that system. But recently, with the technology of ground penetrating radar, they've reached about 7,000 kids now, and they've checked maybe, I think it's 12 schools. So if you can think of 12 out of 186, I believe, that were in Canada, and they're already at that 7,000 number, something is really wrong there, and it's very intentional, like you were saying. The placement of these schools are very isolated. In doing the research that we've been doing, we actually visited a school in Oklahoma, and it's in the middle of nowhere. They still have cemetery there with unknown bodies. And so these children were essentially stolen by the church and the government and were murdered. And a lot of people I've heard have said, well, you know, disease was a killer of a lot of kids. Well, one, would those children have those diseases had they not been stuck into these small, tiny spaces, malnourished for human experiments by the government, as well as abused and worked nearly to death? No, they wouldn't have lost their lives. So I don't want to take up too much time. I did want to read a little bit of this from a survivor. It says, I am a survivor of genocide and torture. At 7 years old, I was taken and placed in the United States residential Indian school system. While in attendance, I was stripped, whipped, beaten, my hair was cut against my will. I was used, I was taken advantage of. Food was withheld. I was punished for speaking my language. I was punished for existing. I was tortured. And so those words are actually from my mother, who is a residential school survivor, Brought Plenty. So she wanted to say a few words. And as you guys can see, like, this wasn't forever ago. Like, we have survivors that are alive today, and their children and their grandchildren.
Good evening. My name is Binaz Bigmarati. I also go by Brought Plenty for the MMIW. It's been going on a long time. My mother was murdered when I was 5. I was 4 going on my 5th birthday. They buried her on my 5th birthday. Also, I lost a niece was murdered as she was coming home from a college. So that's been going on a very long time. I am 70 years old. I have gone to the boarding schools in South Dakota, to 2 of them. I was beat for talking my own language. I was actually taken from my grandma and grandpa, and I never saw them again. I was taken to the boarding school where they brought me in, 2 men brought me in. They stripped me, they cut my hair, they deloused me and sent me to the showers. And I didn't even know what was going on. I was punished a lot by the matrons there. I had to kneel every time they caught me speaking the Sioux language. I had to kneel out in the dark hallways with a brick in each hand and at a stance, not sitting on my legs or my feet. I was beat with rulers all the time. And the things that went on down there at the boarding schools was horrendous. So I am a survivor from the Indian schools and from a genocide. Thank you very much.
Hi there. My name is Valerie, and actually what you just said was a lot of what I was coming up here to say, that I am the granddaughter of a boarding school survivor, and she is not dead. She is not my great ancestor. She is the woman who I walked out the door from saying, "Oh, Mima, I'm gonna go see this panel, and this is what we're talking about." And when I told her the topic, she said, "Oh, I was so scared of them nuns. I was so scared of them nuns," because everything she just told you. My grandma was born in 1941, South Dakota, where Lakota Sioux, Rosebud, South Dakota. And she was stripped from her home the same way. And I know a lot of people, they will like to, blame the victims. Why didn't her parents just say no? Or why didn't they? There was no. They were gonna take your kid either way, or something horrible would happen to you. And also they made it seem like everything's good. This is great for you, for your family, best decision. She was kindergarten age, so I don't know if we're all familiar with kindergartners. The only language she knew was Lakota. And when she spoke that language, she would have all of those things happen to her by the nuns, beaten, and just all sorts of torture happened to her. And that's how she learned English. So some people learn languages one way. That's how my grandma learned English. And then I just tell these stories because so many people wonder why. I'm a 36-year-old woman, mother. I have a teenage kid. But I'm also a full-time university student. So I know a lot of you or most of you are only here because you have to be, extra credit, school assignment, whatever. But this does matter. We are humans, we're a race, we have children, like I said. They go to school beside your nieces, your nephews, your kids, members of your family, and they don't all look Indian. And it matters how we're talked about, how we're treated, how we're represented. And this history that we have on us, it's been mentioned, like, what is the legacy or the repercussions? Like, this all goes down to us, We don't have our language anymore. Why? Because when you walk out of that school, are you gonna talk that language again if you were beaten for it? We had our, our traditions that we were illegal until 20, 30 years ago from the government because they were savage, that we couldn't do. When I told, for what Shaban said, he said, would we be having this conversation if it wasn't for the babies that had been found? I've been writing about this stuff, writing essays, writing monologues, telling people about it since I was 11, 12, 13, 14. Nobody cared. Nobody, oh, you're weird, stop talking about that, or that was so long ago, or whatever. But now that it's like a sensationalized social media story, people are talking about it, which it is good that we're talking about. But when I told my grandma about the babies that were found, the first ones, her reaction wasn't, oh my gosh, they found dead babies. She said, oh, somebody needs to tell them to go look under the schools in South, on our reservation, because they'll find so many bodies under there. So what did they know? What were they seeing? What was happening to all of these kids, And that's just what they were doing to us. Imagine if your brother, your sister, your nieces, your nephews were just going to school and then disappearing every day. I mean, people would be talking about it, and nobody's talking about it. And it would also be having an impact on you. It impacted my grandma. It impacted how she was able to go out in life and try to live. And it impacted the way she thought she should be treated as a wife, and how she understood how to parent because how she was treated. And then it impacted her kids. And then those are our, my brothers over here, that's our parents. There's a clear chain of reaction that goes down. So the drunk Indian comes from somewhere, and it's not a 300-year-old history. And it matters, and it should matter, because we're people, and people should matter to other people. So I just did want to say that it's not an old, way back when past, and it does affect, people today. So thank you.
I did want to mention too that, we're talking about children that died in the boarding schools. There's the children that were removed from their families. Then there were the children that were the babies that were the result of sexual violence to the teen girls that were in the boarding schools. So I just wanted to. The boys too, yes. Yes. Correct. So I just wanted to say that.
My name's Albert Old Crow from the Cheyenne Nation. My mother was taken at first grade age to Concho boarding school. And I asked her, why did you go? Why couldn't you just say no? And she said the reason why her parents were told why they were taking them is because they didn't pay taxes to the public school. And so there she was, 6, 7 years old. Can you imagine 6 or 7 years old? Not going away just for a day, but for the whole school year. And yeah, she had her burdens that she carried. She wouldn't share them with me. I can remember being 7 or 8 years old. And my cool cousin, he went to Concho. He had the hair slicked back and was it ducktail? I told my mom, I want to go to Concho. Holy crap. No. Not no, but hell no. You are not going there. And so my mom never said the reason why she didn't teach us our language, but in my heart, I know it's because of the torture she went through for speaking the language, because she could still speak it. But she didn't want us to go through that same trauma. I get called white person because I don't speak the language. I roll around in the parking lot with my own people because of that. those boarding schools accomplished what they set out to do, is divide and conquer. No connection with the older people because of the language. I'm blessed because I do participate in their ceremonies. And I don't give a crap if my other tribal members call me white boy. I don't care. I'm there. One drop of Cheyenne blood, I'm Cheyenne. Right? That's what I tell my granddaughter. It wasn't until recently that the government put a pedigree on us. How many want to be a pure blood? Dog, horse, be right there with those dogs and horses. Oh yeah, look, I prance real good because I'm full blood. No. Told my granddaughter, I said, even if you don't have that card, you're still Cheyenne. If you want to go through ceremony, I'm not going to be at that door to keep you away because you got Cheyenne blood in you. Those of you that are not native, I'll share this experience with you. I was good in athletics, baseball, basketball. Spring break, I went to school at Edmond. Spring break, we went to Louisiana. Grambling put us up. The whole team put us up. We hit the campus. Those little white boys were hanging around. They was hanging up to me and those three other black players. They didn't know how to be in the minority. If you want to experience what being in the minority is, walk across the campus of Grambling University. And you get a small glimpse of what we experience, not occasionally, but every day. Some of your people don't even have to say a word. I can tell that you don't like me, and you don't even know me. Tough doo-doo. I'm here. I have an education, got a 4-year degree, and I'm sober. So y'all consider me dangerous, and I'm good with that. Thanks.
So I want to thank each of you who've spoken for these very powerful words, and for opening up to us and sharing with us and teaching us. And actually, I think this leads us to a good question that we need to consider, and that is, what can we do to support healing in American Indian communities? And what can we do to bring reform to Christianity and to the narrative that we tell about our country that is so different from the truth? Now, that's a lot of stuff to answer, and I'm watching the clock over here. So just choose any aspect of that y'all would like to speak on, and maybe for the next 10 or so minutes, we can have this discussion. Who wants to go first?
So with this question, the first thing I thought was, what needs to happen is the truth needs to be told. The truth needs to be acknowledged. Because the work with MMIW and with social work background and helping people with domestic violence, things like that, anyone dealing with violence and sexual assault, and then, it was brought up numerous times just now too, one of the biggest deterrents to healing and living, the healthiest life you possibly can is being ignored and not being acknowledged that this happened to you. And that's on top of the violence and sexual assault and things like that. and it's such a big part to have justice, even if it is in the form of a colonized system, to see that, to hear that, to have it be told, to have the opportunity to be seen as you were telling the truth and you're not crazy. It wasn't made up. And you were a child when these things happened. These things are extremely important to being healthy and healing in any kind of way. But then you have to look at, colonization and colonialism, what that's done to our people. We don't have the infrastructure and things to heal properly. So, we can say we want an apology, and we can say that we need to be acknowledged, and, these lies need to be told, and, everything like that. But if it's not backed up with the infrastructure and the resources that we need to heal, mental health care, things like that, then, it's a lie. So I think that's what stops this from happening, that truth being told. We've been taught for generations this history that was written by people that, violently took this land. I've heard my whole life, history is written by the conqueror, the victor, and it's still happening to this day, and those things are upheld, and that's why we still struggle with not having the way to heal properly. And I think, if we can say that we need that truth acknowledged and that truth told, but if it's like, okay, I believe you, then, and nothing to back it up with that mental health care and things like that, the resources and infrastructure to live healthy lives, then it's basically a lie. So there's a lot to that when we say we need to be heard and to be acknowledged in that way. It's a crucial step, but there's so much behind that. But I think that's the first thing, because there's so much trauma that came from violence and sexual assault and abuse and things like that. That's the very first thing that needs to happen, is that the truth needs to be acknowledged on a large scale so that people can come forth behind that veil of they don't want to tell for different reasons. And that's generations of people. I mean, literally generations of people that need to hear that. And like how, our community here mentioned, it's not our ancestors, it's our parents, our grandparents. And it would be extremely impactful for our healing.
And just to make it real clear, this is something that I didn't say in the first portion, but for all of our students here, that they need to understand that after all of that, the statistics that I shared, every initiative from this experience called boarding schools undermined our humanity and right to exist as Indigenous peoples. Simply put, it undermined our ability to say, this is the language I want to speak, this is the clothing I want to wear, this is the cosmology I live under, this is my religious articulation, this is how I worship. I may not use the term God, all of these things. This is how I believe in the afterlife. All of that was undermined. Even to this point today, where we are still in a corporate denial, we do have legislation in place in the US government that is trying to establish the Truth and Healing Commission right now because of everything that's gone on. It was reintroduced on September 30th for specific reasons. That legislation was also introduced a year ago and did not get out of committee. So that kind of tells you the nature of this cycle of violence that we are in. By acknowledging that, hopefully we will attain the freedom to begin the process to fully figure things out on our own as self-determinate sovereign people, going through our own, because there's a conversation we have with ourselves too, internally, with our own communities, because we are all descendants of survivors, whether we realize it or not. My own grandparents were at Shalako boarding school. My grandfather was what we call a hiniha of a chiaha, a ceremonial ground. I have a similar position at this moment at a different ceremonial ground today. We have to have that freedom to do whatever it is the cycle of healing asks of us, using our ceremonial life, recovering our language, reestablishing our understanding in this world. But I'll be darned, the violence still continues, as was well articulated by our relatives here. And so allowing us, affirming those things. You just heard a way of helping right now, that there's an initiative taking place to help bring truth and balance back. All around us, there are ways to help, to acknowledge us, acknowledge what's going on. And that's what my hope is that with each one of you, because I say we talked about this, but we didn't talk about it as we were growing up. We didn't sit there and say, well, Grandpa, tell me about Shalako. But no, we felt the impact of that. My uncle telling me a story of a ceremonial fluent speaker. He came home to my grandpa crying in his closet because he had read in the Christian Bible that you're supposed to go to your prayer closets. He was trying to pray. He was trying to figure things out. But he too suffered from substance abuse and things of that nature and died untimely. We've all heard those stories, but we didn't connect it to everything that we now know. And that's what my hope is that we now know, and for any partner or ally, give us that freedom to begin this process of figuring things out, affirm what we're doing, accept what we're doing. And if you're called to do so, call your legislature and say, why haven't we had this commission in place already? So I'll stop there now.
One of the roles that I have in life is I'm a professor at University of Texas at Dallas in the Early Childhood Disorders program. And my specialty is infant mental health. And so something I just want to throw out to you is, I think most of us who at least have personal knowledge of survivors, most of them were taken away around 5, 6, around there. So this comes from a book called High Risk. It's about the things that we do to children that can create a sociopath, can create people without conscience, can create people without healthy emotion, like Albert. I saw him pointing at himself. But just for example, a 6-year-old child cannot be away from their family, from people that they love, particularly mom and dad, for more than 4 weeks before there is damage that happens between that child and their family. So it's not only damage to the child, it's damage to the relationship. And for us, family is our tribe, right? Family is our nation. So it's not just us to our mom and dad, it's us to all of our mom, dad, cousins, grandmas, grandpas, aunts, uncles, and all that all of the people in our nation. So that's a 5-year-old. So now we look at today and we think, well, what if we're going to heal? If we're going to have to heal ourselves, I believe, first, because nobody's going to understand the fact that we never used corporal punishment on our children. We respected our children as equal to adults in terms of their knowledge. In fact, a child under 4 had more knowledge and wisdom because they hadn't already been messed with by the adults. So we honored our children on an equal level. We also didn't neglect and abandon our children. So everything that happened at the boarding schools was completely opposite teaching to our traditional ways of parenting, our traditional ways of raising children. Today, I see the remnants of that too. When I hear a Native parent say, I'm gonna spank your butt if you don't stop what you're doing, the first thought I have is, where did that come from? Where did it come from that the answer to a child being mischievous and exploratory and verbal and all these kind of things that we valued as a culture is supposed to be shut down with hitting? And a lot of y'all will argue with me, but I think Christianity brought that whole concept also into that. So in terms of personally, I feel like our own communities, We have to relearn our parenting techniques, and we need to implement them with the families in our communities. We need to provide that support. We need to prevent any child from being removed from its parents. There's enough Native people around that we can supply the nurturance that needs to happen. And especially in Texas, we got a huge problem with our child welfare system. Jody can attest to that. So we need to retrieve and embrace our traditional ways. And we need to do them in modern society. We can do it. The other thing is we need to look at our brothers and sisters who were marginalized by these systems, and we as a Native community are doing the same thing. When we turn away from all of our Texas Indian people who were in the mission system, which did the same damage, it was the same people. They were Franciscan, priests and nuns. They did the same thing to our Texas Indians. So if we're not embracing them, if we're not embracing, like what Albert's saying, our children that no longer have the, quote, blood quantum to be able to vote for their tribe, when we turn them away, guess what? We're becoming exactly like the system that was implemented in the US. We got to rethink this.
Thanks to all of you. We're almost out of time, but I did want to give an opportunity if there's anybody in the audience who wants to make a quick statement or ask a quick question, please feel free to come now and do that. Otherwise, we will move to one last question, and then we're going to do something to honor these children and their families. So, yes, please.
I wanted to tell you what I've seen, especially amongst my own family. My two siblings, myself, did go to boarding school. One of the first things they do is condition you not to ever share what is going on in these schools. They silence you with that. I kept my secret up until about 2 years ago. At 22 years of age, I started my mental health, healing myself. And I still do to this day. I go to a therapist and I talk. I never even shared with my children what happened to me, nor did I share with any psychiatrist, therapist, what had happened to me up until 2 years ago. That's when it started, because it has a trickle-down effect. My mother was there. I was there in the boarding school. It has effect on my children and my grandson. But these are my future. And we have to start healing someplace. And it's bringing out the elderly people and letting them be heard and believing in them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, one last question, if I could ask each of you to answer quickly, because we're about out of time. So everything that we've talked about tonight, what are the implications of that for us here at TCU, at Texas Christian University? I mean, what do we do with this? How should we think about this? What are your thoughts about that?
I think that respecting other people's belief systems is the first step. Part of this is, part of my family's issue is proselytizing, the need or the mandate to go out and recruit or to gather members to increase the flock. And this, as a Christian university, I don't know what that means exactly. Like, I don't know if it means that religious education is a requirement of being here, or that the goal of the religious education is to proselytize and to bring into the flock of this, of the foundation of this university. So if you want to heal, you have to be open and listen to people who are different than you, like we're doing today. I appreciate so much every one of you students here, whether you were required to be here or not. You know, it touches our heart to have you stay. You know, it touches our heart to have you here. So I think that the first step is some very personal dialogues. I'm a believer in one-on-one talking. I feel like that's how we get to know one another. It's hard to do it in a big group like this, but that would be one thing I would suggest, is to, as a university, to take action to get to know other people that are not like you, and to get to know us would be good.
Yeah, I think, you know, the one thing that comes to my mind is, you know, that TCU has a land acknowledgement, they have a monument, they acknowledge that they're on stolen land, but how are they gonna back it up? Just like what I mentioned with the healing process, you know, you can acknowledge that this happened, but how are you gonna help that process? And I feel like one of the biggest steps, you know, in decolonizing academia is to acknowledge that we're experts without a PhD. You don't have the knowledge that we have. You don't have ceremony knowledge, star knowledge, anything about how families work within tribes and things like that. And I feel like once on this level of a university, when you can acknowledge that we have experts within our tribes and our communities, and that's what you do. You bring those people in to teach. You know, you want to have these conversations about different people. That's how you do it. That's how you do it, by acknowledging that. You know, I recently told Scott this just not too long ago when we were talking about MMIW. You know, like, I'm thankful for Scott, even if it's one person within this entire university that feels like, you know, we're experts here. Everybody that got on the mic, not only on the panel, but here from our community as well. That aspect of being human needs to be acknowledged and uplifted and embraced in different ways. You know, because I've joked around with Scott as well that Siobhan needs to be a professor in the religion department. So things like that need to happen and be acknowledged.
I think just, excuse me, just acknowledging the serious nature of the conversation and even the responsibilities that come with entering a relationship with our community, so that even as I was whispering to Jody while we were hearing our relatives share a little bit, is that realizing there's more work to be done. You know, one of the things that our communities have done, and even the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in First Nations communities of Canada, they had enormous listening sessions for years where people could just come and share, this is what's happened. Now, the Canadian government was supposed to respond to that, which I guess this is their response, is uncovering these mass grave sites. But that's where it starts, so that we can have a chance to share these stories, because they are so immense. And why can't Texas Christian be a catalyst for wellness in our overall community? Why can't we be in a place of having a prophetic vision of wellness for everyone who is in the Dallas Metroplex, not just a select privilege who get to come to higher education, of recognizing that with education and training comes that responsibility, that these are the future leaders that are going into the world. And what knowledge will they take with them? Will they continue to perpetuate the harm that has happened? Or will they make a stand when they see that harm present and say, no more? So my hope is that somehow that this will just be one step in its developing its relationship, Texas Christian University, with our people, with our Native American, with Indigenous peoples. Because as we are recognizing, I was just asked this question by NPR reporter last week. Have these boarding schools, were they effective in what they did to the people, to the Indigenous peoples? And I kind of gave a crass answer, because I said, well, the jury's really still out, because we're still in a fight to recover and reclaim those things that were put in jeopardy. Our understanding of wellness, our understanding of living in harmony with the earth, our understanding of spirituality, our understanding of language? And I can't answer that question just yet, because there may come a time. There may come a time when we have lost all of those things. So I think TCU can be in a place to help with that resistance and saying that we will be a place where people can at least speak the truth freely.
So we've come to now the last part of our program, which is we want to spend just a couple of minutes, 2, 3, 4 minutes, honoring the children who went through these schools and their families. But before we do that, I want to thank y'all for being here, and I want to thank y'all as well. Thank you. You have spoke to our hearts as well as our minds and opened our eyes in a good way. And as you always do, you're leading us on down the path, and we thank you for that. For the students, if you could just stay in place until this very important honoring ceremony is over, and then you can come and swipe your ID cards over here. I'm going to give this to Chaban, and I'm going to walk over and turn on those machines because they have to warm up. But Chaban?
If you'll just bear with me for just a few more minutes. I told Dr. Langston I would have brought some of my instruments with me, but I kind of left them at home. I was worried about traffic, and I forgot them. But I'm going to share just these. I was going to do a song, but now just hearing these stories here, talk about my relatives here, I'm going to try to do 3 songs. They're all from different cultures, but they represent our spirituality, and I'm going to sing these to honor, our grandparents, our ancient ones, our ancestors. But before I do that, I got to say some things in my language. I'm going to introduce myself to the spirit world. And even, they say that the difference between us and them in my culture, they say the difference between us and them is only as thick as a leaf on a tree, so that they're still kind of here giving a witness to our presence in the lives that we're living. So I'm going to do the best I can just to tell them who I am, who I belong to, and my clan lineage, and the responsibilities I have. And then I'm going to try to do my best to share those songs to honor those children, to honor our survivors, honor our people. Hopefully give us the strength to continue this journey so that maybe one day our grandchildren won't have to do this. Our great-grandchildren won't have to do this. They'll be up here speaking in our language fully. Chabon Colonel Choho Chifkados. Haro Gogi, Amalegadon, Ambozit, Nogo Sogadios. Halobi Kanidi Adolwa, Intazakai Owis. Halobi Kanidi, Olegade Hutkin Legat. That's who I represent. This first song is what we sing in our church settings. It talks about a long time ago they were here. Oh, holy, yaman, holy. Oh, holy, yaman, holy. Oh, holy, yaman, holy. Is for my egos, because above it, oh, yat study, next song was taught to me by one of my relatives, Ponca people. So I'll say that as I was just thinking about them tonight and some of the schools they went through, testimonies that I heard from them. This one was used in churches, but also in our peyote religion, Native American church people. So I'll probably go ahead and just stop with this one a little bit because it honors a different spirituality too. And that one talks about God, what God has made is good. And that's what we teach our people. Our indigenous peoples were made by our Creator, and we're not a mistake. We're meant to be on this earth mother, and today we honor them. So I say, Mado, Jage Jisje, and I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Langston. Thank you.